I feel like one of the most empowering and motivating things that ever happened to me was to be a lesbian at this time in history where so much could happen. Where when I came out, I was worried about losing custody of a child, where I was worried about would I have a career, where I was worried about what my life would be like in every possible way because I was a lesbian. And it has been an infusion of strength and hopefulness and agency. I would never have done half the things I've done if I had been one of my straight sisters. It's powerful to be in a group that bands together, never perfectly, certainly, but bands together and says, we will make change, and then to do it.
We ain't throwing starfish here, now we're having a good party. Talking about structural change. We believe the land is sacred, even beneath that vacant parking lot. But the weeds are doing their best to express the need for something different. Gonna make some space for you and me to live here all together. Gonna make it safe and fun for kids to get around the town. Gonna find me a residential pedestrian district where I can gracefully grow older. Gonna spend my remaining years sharing Boulder.
Hello, Boulder and the wider world. This is the Sharing Boulder podcast. My name is Philip Ogren, and for episode 50, I spoke with Glenda Russell, who is a historian of the LGBTQ movement as it has unfolded here in Boulder and Colorado and beyond. Glenda has had a long career as a clinical psychologist, educator, and writer, and has a PhD in psychology from the University of Colorado at Boulder. We talked about the struggle to get sexual orientation included in Boulder's Human Rights Ordinance, which was added in 1987 by means of a ballot measure that won by a very small margin, after a similar ballot measure was crushed 13 years earlier. This story includes many interesting characters, including Penfield Tate, who was a tireless human rights activist and for whom our municipal building is now named, Tim Fuller, who was considered a more radical liberal who ran on a tenants' rights platform, and Glenda herself, who showed up at many contentious city council meetings during this time and started taking notes about what she witnessed. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Glenda Russell. Glenda Russell, welcome to Sharing Boulder. Thank you so much for being here and spending time with me on a Saturday morning. It's delightful to have you.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm thrilled to be here.
Great. Well, please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do.
By training, I'm actually a psychologist. I'm a licensed psychologist in the state of Colorado. And but somewhere along the way, and maybe I'll tell that story today, in 1974, I was in a situation watching city council meet and talk about queer issues, and I started taking notes, and I've been taking notes ever since, and that's a long time. So if you take notes that long, apparently you graduate into being a community historian.
Yeah. Okay.
And that's an important thing. I'm not trained as a historian. But I have been tracking queer history in Boulder since the early 70s, and I'm fascinated by it, and I'm in the process of writing a book about it. And it's a fascinating history, and most of the history written about the queer movement is history of things that happen on either coast. And the flyover states have been largely, not entirely, but largely missing from that history. And it turns out that Boulder, in particular, in Colorado, that's a great slip of the tongue, yeah. Isn't it? And Colorado, in general, have been notable in their contributions to queer history in this country.
Wonderful. Well, just before we got rolling, I was telling you that Ren and I sat here 2 weeks ago, and we kind of cut off the conversation because we're like, oh, we should include this as part of the recording. So yeah, we went to the Colorado Queer Comedy Festival.
That's what it was
last
called.
Month in November, and I went Friday night and you went Saturday night. I had such a wonderful time. It was just an electric, energized crowd, and I don't know. You tell me about your reaction to it.
I also had a wonderful time. The snowstorm notwithstanding.
Yeah.
And part of why I had a wonderful time is it's really good to go laugh. I don't
Yeah.
care what's going on. And so, that was an opportunity to laugh a lot. I think beyond that, Ren put together some great folks, many of whom were from Colorado, some of whom were from elsewhere. And it is such a wonderful thing when members of a community come together for anything, practically speaking, and particularly when there are limited opportunities for those members of communities to come together. And then when they come together to make fun, there's something magical that happens because they're speaking in something of a different language. What's in the room is the usual kind of humor, and then there's this substrate of cultural humor that is like, you might say, inside jokes, and that's just so welcoming and so validating, and it's an opportunity for those of us who are in part of the queer and trans community to learn about others who are in other parts of the queer and trans community.
Sure.
So that's also like you can be an insider and an outsider depending on the nature of the jokes being told.
Well, yeah, I mean, I assume you and Ren have very different experiences moving through life, and the lives that you've had, that you're born different years and you have different letters from the alphabet,
Yeah, right. Yes, we do. And that is one of the great things. I mean, I am cisgender. It was really, there was a lot of trans humor there. Mm-hmm. And that's a great way to learn about other people. We know that learning in a safe environment is the best way to learn. It's probably the only way to learn, really.
Yeah. And
what better way to create safety than somebody telling jokes and inviting you to participate in the life?
Well, it makes me wonder if have you been to a comedy event like that before?
I've not that big, because there
were
16 or 17 comedians.
Yeah, and over 100 people. It's kind of a small venue, but it was packed.
Yeah. It was on the next night as well. So I've been to smaller events of that sort of. Haven't been to anything that had that many comedians and that many people in the audience. At some conferences that I've been to, some activist conferences have comedians, and the women's community in particular, the lesbian community in particular, has a really strong cultural history of women comics who are wonderful and fill cruise ships literally with lesbians.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, so why don't we talk about Boulder's history of LGBTQ or queer community? You were telling me about on the way here you had a tripod of things to consider as you're kind of like thinking about.
And maybe we'll talk about that, but I'm also thinking of going back to that moment when I started taking notes.
Oh, please.
On what was happening. Because it's a fascinating story, and a lot of people don't know that history. A lot of queer people don't know that history. It happened in 1973 is when it began. The city of Boulder had passed a human rights ordinance, and it was fairly early in the annals of such municipal ordinances that prohibited discrimination. And there was talk because of a group that was a student group, but it had lots of community folks as well, called Boulder Gay Liberation Front. And Boulder Gay Liberation Front asked the two sponsors of that ordinance if they would include sexual preference. Now, notice it was called sexual preference then. That changed in the middle of this story.
Those conversations.
It became sexual orientation for strategic reasons. Or in reaction to the pushback it was a strategic reason to change that.
Stop having that preference.
Yes.
Could you
That's
prefer
right.
something else, please?
No, and that's where
Yeah.
we started picking up the I'm born that way. I can't help it. Now, if you think about it, I'm born that way is really just a sidestep from I can't help it, which sort of buys into the notion, or at least implies the notion that it's a bad thing and you could if you would.
Yeah.
And
Right.
that's a problematic kind of construction. It made sense in the political environment that we were in. We're talking the early 70s.
Right.
This is a few years after Stonewall, the rebellion in New York that happened in June of 1969. We have just been, in 2 years earlier, released from the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual saying we were crazy. We are still illegal. Same-sex sex is still illegal in lots of states, most states.
Like on the books, like you're not allowed to have this kind of sex
That's
with
right.
these kinds of people. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That didn't change for a long time. And so you have, so you're asking for rights, and, we still don't trust you in terms of mental health. The law doesn't like you, and religion sure as heck doesn't like you. And those are those three structural legs of the tripod, by the way, the law, mental health, and religion. And we were barely out of the woods with any of those. And so when people pushed back, it makes sense that we would say, okay, it's not really a preference that we choose. We were born this way, And that's still the language of that is still very prominent in the queer rights movement, and still begs for critique, I think, given what it implies about us.
Because is it because there's a rigidity baked into being born a certain way, and when really like humans are fluid and we change through our lives?
It turns out that we have a lot of data that suggests people are much more fluid than we give them credit for being. One of the things, Kinsey had shown us this earlier, even earlier than this 1973 and 74 time. I mean, one of the things that Kinsey found out from his work that shocked the heck out of people was that there was a lot more homosexuality going on than anybody knew. That was true in his first study with men. It was true in his second study of women. And as a therapist for 35 years, I was a practicing therapist, and I learned people's secrets, and I had a very diverse practice, always did and always wanted to. And I thought, just people are not in the categories that they're supposed to be, or that their language would suggest they are. And that's because we are much more fluid than we give ourselves credit for being. And that's too bad, because it constrains us in all kinds of ways that makes life much more, well, I would say at the very least, much less interesting than it would otherwise be. And a part of it was the pushback against including sexual preference in the human rights ordinance was very specific. Well, these other things we include, people are born that way. People are born male or female. That's up for grabs. Actually, right now, people are born into a different race. Never mind that those races are constructed and change in how we think about them from one era to another and from one place to another. But at the time, we were believing people were born in those ways, so it was an easy thing to say. My sexual orientation is so much a part of who I am that it feels like I was born that way too. Never mind that religion was also covered in this ordinance, and religion is definitely not something that people are born with. You don't spring into the world with a particular religion. Somebody may, pull you into that religion through baptism or some other mechanism, but nobody says, this has got to be a Catholic kid.
Back up for me for a second. The setting is city council,
right?
Circa 1973.
Actually, 74 now, because
74.
The fight started in 73, but this is 74.
The proposal on the table is to pass a human rights statement. Is it a legal? Is it legal? Does it have legal teeth to it? Yeah.
Yes,
it's about discrimination and jobs.
That's
and
right.
Benefits and that kind of stuff.
Right. And it already, in fact, had been passed just very recently But the question on the table was, are we going to include sexual preference in this thing? And council had looked at that issue in December of 73 and said yes. And then there was a backlash, and various people in the community said that was if you'll excuse the language, a lame duck council. So instead, we want the new council to do it. Well, the new council did the exact same thing in early 74. And then there was a really big backlash. And so there was a public hearing on the issue. There were 400 people at the council meeting. 400 people cannot fit into council chambers. There were 200 in chambers. 200 were watching on closed circuit TV.
Same building that we have now in Canyon? Okay.
Yes, same building.
I think it seats 200 maybe at the most if you're standing remotely.
Yeah. Well, there were 200 people downstairs in the... I don't know which, on the first floor, but basically not very comfortable. But they had put chairs out. A little context: the mayor at the time was a man named Penfield Tate.
Yes.
The second, for whom that building is now named. Long overdue, I would say. Penfield Tate is the person who, at the request of the Boulder Gay Liberation Front folks, decided to propose including sexual preference in the human rights ordinance. That proposal was co-sponsored by a man named Tim Fuller, who was a new council member. People at the time would have described him as a hippie. He had long hair, he had a mustache. He worked in a bookstore collective on the Hill, and he ran on a tenants' rights platform to get on council. And he actually was far more, if you will, liberal than Penn was. Penn was a political moderate in many ways, but Penn Tate, who was Boulder's first and so far only black mayor, was a man who had an absolutely deep and abiding belief in human rights and civil rights. And anything in that domain, he was going to be
all the way. Yeah.
And he had sponsored it. Tim had co-sponsored it. And all of these people are now coming together, 400 in the building, probably a pretty evenly divided between pro and con, I'm guessing. They were in the council chambers. That's where I was. So you could sort of see the energy. In fact, people kind of segregated themselves for as long as they could as we were moving into the room. And those of us who were for for including sexual preference in that amendment actually had lavender armbands on, so it was kind of visible. So the hearing went on and on. There was true vitriol. I mean, are we going to have a lesbian homo bill here? There was a lot of false talk about the absolutely unfounded idea that gay people recruited kids in particular. We see that chestnut follows every major fight about gay rights. It has for decades, and it continues to this day.
It's a big theme with resistance against the trans community.
Absolutely.
Right now. Yeah.
And it's a total lie. And as a psychologist who has worked with a lot of folks who have trauma experiences, it really is such an offensive lie, because in addition to being a lie about a whole community, it also makes it far less likely that we will be able to protect children, because we're looking at the wrong places for where the danger is coming for children. And that is a true disservice to every child. Because if you're saying the gays are doing it or somebody else is doing it, where kids are more likely to be traumatized by inappropriate sexual advances is in their families and in their close communities. Yeah. It's not on the street. Now, some of that does happen on the street, but mostly it's not.
The heartbreaking thing about that is to think about all the abuse that's happened, neglected and unaccounted for over decades.
Yes.
When people are like, oh, gays are like ruining our children. It's like, no, it's these priests are
It's why it's so dangerous. Yeah. It's why it's so... I mean, we do it. Our children are pawns in that. I mean, they are really misused in that argument, because it has us looking at the wrong wrong perpetrators.
The word homoville, it's like, it's kind of, I mean, you laugh. Thank you for laughing, because it generates a kind of a weird response for me, because like the notion that, and I don't mean to, I wasn't there in the 70s, but I can kind of picture the kind of person who might come up to the microphone and start wagging their finger and shout out, Homoville.
She was actually a person who, every speaker had 2 minutes, and unless they collected other people's minutes, and she collected a bunch of other people's minutes, so she had her name was Hilma Skinner. She was Hilma. Sorry, Hilma Skinner. She was a Christian, and she really was offended because she really believed that these people were sinful, and she said that, and that was not implicit, that was explicit, but not just from Hilma. I mean, it was from a lot of people in that room, and I understand they were taught that they were not, it's really easy to assume that people are evil or something, and I think we don't choose what we're taught. We can choose to be critical and look at it and understand it and change it if facts call for that.
We all come out of a cultural setting that shapes us, and we can't. It's difficult to like be objective about all of that. You know?
None of us is, and I really believe that. And we know now, as a psychologist, we know more now about how difficult it is to change that than we even knew in the 70s. I think in the 70s we were coming into this period of huge social and cultural change, and we were much more optimistic. But the data don't really support too much optimism, although the data do say we can change. But as the old joke goes, we have to want to change.
Yeah. Oh, who wants to change? I mean, like we all.
Well, I mean, do you want to?
I mean, as personal work, right?
It is personal work, and it's also social work.
Yeah.
I mean, because one of the reasons people change, and one of the ways communities change, is because we see change around us, and we start talking with other people, and we go, "You think that way? Tell me why. How do you? Oh, you are one of them. Tell me about that." And our worlds get bigger instead of smaller, and it's kind of nice to have a bigger world rather than a smaller world. And
absolutely.
So that's a piece of it. So we're in this room, we're having this conversation, and the council is going, "Oh, we are in a mess here." And the council did something that politicians sometimes do. They went, "Let's punt."
Yeah.
And they made they called the question into a referendum. And so in
it was voted on by the
that's right.
ballot.
So in 1974, the city of Boulder, those who were registered, got to vote, and they voted overwhelmingly to not include sexual preference. By now, it's sexual orientation because it had changed midstream, as I said. They voted not to include sexual orientation in the human rights ordinance.
It was kind of narrowly about that, whether that was going to get included into an existing ordinance.
And at that point, one of the things that happened, I've talked to some people who were kids here, at the high schoolers, say, and people just went, "Oh my goodness, well, we were trying to come out of the closet, but I don't think it's working very well." And
never mind.
People shut down, and I have a friend who said she just stopped even knowing that she was a lesbian at that point, and it took her years to get back to that because she saw this incredible, this incredible bank of people saying, "You don't belong here, and we don't want to talk about this." And it went away. It was like silent after that, except some people decided they wanted to recall Penfield Tate and Tim Fuller, and each of them was, in fact, subjected to a recall. Tim Fuller was recalled, left town shortly after that, and did various really wonderful things.
Recall is another election where you say we want this person out.
Yeah, we want him off. So Tim was recalled. He left. And Penn narrowly survived the recall. But when he ran for re-election, he who had gotten the most votes in the prior election lost in the re-election. He tried after that to do he tried in particular to get on the legislature, and he couldn't get the Dems to give him the time of day. I mean, he was persona non grata. I don't think anybody would object to the observation that Penn Tate gave up a political career, a very promising political career.
On that issue.
On that issue.
Wow.
And I became friends with him later. I don't think he ever regretted it because that was so much where his heart was. I don't think he was pleased about having to do it, but I think he kept his conscience and he kept his sense of himself.
So you're at this city council meeting and you're like, I should pull out my notebook and start writing down. What did you write down? Were you trying to like shorthand the quotes that people were saying, or? Interestingly
enough, I didn't even have a notebook or a pen.
Okay.
And I think the psychologist in me says, I started listening to what was going on, and I recognized the energy before I even got there. I mean, before it even started. They had given us an agenda when we walked in. I had a piece of paper. I borrowed a pen from somebody. And what I started writing was, I wrote the name of each speaker, which side they were on, what their main arguments were, and any sort of color commentary I had about them. Mm-hmm. And I was like writing little tiny, and part of it was, I think I knew I am in the middle of a movement, and I hadn't known I was in the middle of a movement before that day. Mm-hmm. I mean, I just went, this is history being made. I don't know if I'm going to like it or what's happening here or not, but this is history being made. In retrospect, and from my self-awareness as a psychologist, I think I was also going, you need to intellectualize this a bit because it's going to be really painful when you start hearing some of the stuff that people are going to be saying. And so it was a way to kind of get a little bit above it and to think about it a little more rationally rather than to take in some of the really overtly homophobic. This was old-fashioned homophobia where people were not polite about it. It was not politically correct homophobia. It was in-your-face homophobia.
It was not the good kind of homophobia, like the politically correct kind.
Well, you run into that. I run into that sometimes still. I've written about that, actually. I'm really interested in that as a psychologist.
Well, maybe give us the landscape of what that means, of what...
It comes in various forms, Philip. It comes in forms like, I think it's fine you want to do this, but you don't. I think it's fine what you and your girlfriend do, but we don't. Marriage is for heterosexual people.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not mean-spirited. It's not meant to be mean, but you're not quite included.
These are institutions that are in place that have been going on for a long time.
That literally gets said.
You want to just walk in and pretend like it's something else.
Right, exactly. One of my favorite versions, and this is a version that you get in a place like Boulder. I love Boulder, actually. Yeah. Here's a version you get in Boulder. I know you LGBTQ people suffer a lot of things. I'm going to come and help you.
There, it's like, I know you people.
And I'm going to help you.
Yeah.
Because you need my help. Because, y'all have a lot of suicide. And, so there's even helpful kinds of stances can reinforce the power difference between groups of people in a way that's very insidious and very hard for when we do it to another group. It's kind of, we think we're being nice. And we're trying to be nice. And that's where an important distinction is between the intent and the impact, of course, because the impact is like, do I need your help, or am I that bad off? Or do you only care about me if you can rescue me? Mm-hmm. I mean, it's an interesting dynamic. That's the good homophobia.
Okay, so to speak. Yeah. Yeah. Now, this is be clear for anyone listening audio only. She's air quoting here.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Interesting.
Shall I talk about the next big issue that happened in Boulder?
Yes, please.
After that, I mean, with the following year. Okay, so Penn's still serving on council. Tim's gone. Everybody has the whole issue has dried up. We're not talking about it. But then we had to talk about it again because 2 young men in El Paso County went into the clerk's office and asked for a marriage license. And the clerk said, we don't do that here. But the clerk also said, you might try Boulder. Right. And they said, you might try Boulder because, everybody had read look what happened in Boulder. In fact, queer stuff was really invisible in 1973 and 74. So when this kind of thing happened with the Human Rights Ordinance, it was huge.
It was very visible statewide.
Yes, absolutely.
Did it get national attention?
It got some national attention, yes. It would have gotten more national attention if it had been by a major media market.
Yeah.
But
a county clerk in El Paso knew about it.
Absolutely.
And so did everyone else
Absolutely.
around them. Yeah.
Now, so they sent these two guys up here, and in truth, Penn Tate had been approached in the meantime by a couple of same-sex couples who wanted to apply for marriage licenses. And he had looked at it legally. He was a lawyer. And he said, there's nothing in the statute that genders this thing. And he had warned the people in the clerk's office that this might happen. He was not talking about the two guys from
El Paso
County,
okay.
But they got here first. And so they came up. But in the meantime, the county clerk, a woman named Glenda Russell, who was a young feminist, had only recently been elected to the county clerk's office. She had been forewarned a bit that this might be coming and had gotten a little advice on it. And she was told that, in fact, the statute was silent on the issue of the sex of the people who applied for licenses. They were silent because nobody ever imagined that they had to write down one man and one woman. That's why it was silent. It wasn't, it was one of those things where we take it so much for granted that marriage only applies to one man and one woman that we can't even, we don't even bother putting it down.
It's not even in the law.
Right, exactly. So Clela, over the course of a couple of weeks, handed out.
What was her name again?
Clela.
Clela.
Clela. Clela handed out 6 licenses to same-sex couples. And then you would have thought, then that did make national news. In fact, Johnny Carson told a joke about it on The Tonight Show.
Was it friendly?
No.
Okay.
There were not many friendly jokes about this. In fact, Clela got quite a few letters that were condemning her, damning her in some cases.
Yeah. Damning to hell.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. And Clela had very little, by her own admission, Clela had very little awareness of the community. There was one guy in the clerk's office who was gay, whom she knew. But basically, she didn't know gay people to speak of. And she was taking the advice of the county attorney, or the assistant county attorney, actually. And she was shocked by the.
She wasn't like a human rights insider.
She was.
Activist.
She was not an insider. Yeah. She was pretty young. She had been in NOW, the National Organization for Women, and in fact, that was the thing that she drew on explicitly. Was I don't want people to discriminate against me. I don't want to discriminate against anybody else. Yeah. And as she has said it, she passed a couple of years ago now, but as she said it before she died in multiple venues, she didn't know much about the issue. She's learned a lot about it, and over time she became an ally. Then she was kind of an accidental ally. I mean, and she and the queer community really never got together on it, because the queer community are going, oh my God, do you know what happened to us last year? We do not want this. I mean, yeah. I mean, it
might not be perfectly welcome what she did, suddenly, right?
She did it, I think, with good motives.
Yeah.
And she did it with the permission of the people who tended to the law for the county. The Attorney General of the state, a guy named McFarland, also tended to the law, and he told her to stop, which she did. So after 6 licenses were passed out, there were no more licenses.
And then were those 6 revoked?
Interestingly enough, McFarland says they are not valid. That's what he said in his statement. It never was tested in any court. It never went through any court process. Well, it did actually later it went through immigration court, because 2 of the guys who got licenses, there's actually a movie about these 2 guys. 2 of the guys who got licenses represented an international couple. One was from here, one was from Australia. And they wanted to stay here. They'd already been kicked out of the country once because the the Australian man's visa had expired. They had sneaked back into the country, as a matter of fact. And they came from California. They heard about it on the Johnny Carson show, where I get my news. They heard about it on the Tonight Show. They came here and got the license. And then they actually petitioned to Immigration and Naturalization, I think it was called at the time, and asked and said that, they should be allowed to stay in this country because they were now married. One of them was a U.S. citizen.
Yeah.
And they actually got a letter. They actually received a letter from Immigration and Naturalization that said, you have not established that a marital relationship, this is not a direct quote, it's very close, and the last part will be a quote. You have not established that a marital relationship can exist between two faggots. That's what the letter from the government said. The government has since apologized for that, by the way, but only just a couple of years ago.
This is coming down from, that wording would have been approved from someone in INS that oversaw that case.
Presumably.
Yeah. Okay. Wow.
Well, at least somebody didn't stand in its way or go ask or something, but that was what the letter said. So that's the only time it was adjudicated, but that was an immigration case.
I think we need air quotes again.
Thank you. Yes, you're good with the air quotes. Anyway, and then that went away again, and that kind of, although here's a way that the homophobia comes back in. A guy named something Howard came to the courthouse, within a matter of weeks or months. It's not a long time at all. After that, and he had his horse named Dolly, and he had actually warned Cleland that he was coming, and he said he wanted to marry his horse. And the implicit thing, of course, in this is that if a man can marry a man, then I should be able to marry my horse. Now, look at all the homophobia in that.
Yeah, yeah.
Cleela went through her check boxes, and when she asked the age of the bride, he gave her the age, I think it was 8 or something, and she said, sorry, Dolly is not old enough. And then they actually kind of became sort of friendly. There was a photo a little later in the Daily Camera of Cleela riding Dolly.
This is so weird. Oh my God.
Tell me about it. And think about, for people who are listening in particular, you get it clearly, Philip. But people who are listening, just think about, you are a young person in Boulder, and this is how people are talking about you and your love.
Yeah.
That's not useful.
No.
And that's an understatement. The next hit in Boulder's history on this, things went quiet again. People are going, oh my God, let's just never talk about this. Meanwhile, gay rights are sort of moving on around the country a bit. And in 1987, so this is a jump of 14 years, 13 years, because the marriages were in 75. In 1987, there were some young women, one of whom had just graduated from CU, and she came from New Jersey in a nice liberal family, and she found out somehow that Boulder's human rights ordinance didn't cover sexual orientation, and she went, that's so bizarre. We need to change that. And so she went and her name is Kat Morgan, and she went and she talked to some of the more likely people on council who might be interested in changing this. And they said to her, do you know what happened in 1974 here? And she went, no. And Kat describes it as she and her friends were off reading the microfiche in the library, trying to find out, well, what the heck happened here? And they found out, and they realized that none of the council members was willing to put it on was willing to bring it up for a council vote. They were not, and it was political suicide. Just ask Penn Tate, ask Tim Fuller. And so they decided they were going to have to get a petition out and get enough citizens to sign and say that they wanted to have this thing come up for, guess what, a vote of the people. And so there was a referendum in 87. Some of us who were now older So I was working with a group of people, a group of women, some straight, some lesbian. We called Penn Tate. We said, Penn, would you come over and talk with us? And he said, yeah. And we said, Penn, here's this coming again. We're not sure it can pass again. We know what happened last time. It was really destructive. What the heck do you recommend?
Yeah, what can we do different?
Penn Tate said, well, I don't know if it'll pass this time. But what I do know is sometimes you have to do something because it's the right thing to do. And we're all sitting there sort of hanging our heads going, thank you for giving us the obvious advice. This was a man who believed that so deeply in his soul, he didn't have to think twice. He just didn't have to think twice. He really was a heroic human being in a lot of ways, not just around this issue. So there were these folks collected enough signatures to get it on the ballot, and there was a referendum in '87. They had a great button that said, "Isn't it queer?" in big words on the button. Isn't it queer that Boulder's human rights ordinance doesn't cover sexual orientation? That was a great button because people weren't using queer normally in '87. So I liked it. I still have that button. So the vote came down to the last precinct. I mean, it won by under 300 votes.
Oh, wow.
But we did not know, because it was that close, we did not know until the last precinct if it was going to carry or not. And I think it was surprising to a lot of people that it did. And then there are people who, I mean, another way to be homophobic is to deny that homophobia exists.
It's not a problem, see?
Right, exactly. You got it. I called Penn the next morning as soon as I got to my office. I was a little worried I would wake him up because I started my day early. And I mean, he had this great laugh, and he just laughed his way through the conversation, and he was in such a good mood. And he said, I feel vindicated. And I said, you are vindicated.
Well, what changed between 74 and 87 that allowed that vote to flip?
I think a couple of things. We were no longer the first. We weren't the first anyway. But when 74 happened, there were about already 50 municipalities around the country that already covered sexual orientation in whatever sort of non-discrimination ordinance it had. So it wasn't like we were the earliest show around. There had not been referenda about it, however. Mm-hmm. And that's different to have a body like a city council or that sort of body make a decision like that versus having it become part of a campaign where the campaign can stir up lots of homophobia and, so
the other 50 were the councilors unseated.
Yeah.
Just passed an ordinance like you normally would.
And
Boulders was a first.
And they were in pretty liberal town, Ann Arbor, Michigan.
Sure.
They were in towns where you would expect that sort of thing to happen. And you had, enough people on the council who were willing to take the risk, and you didn't have a reaction from the population that, because they're kind of liberal anyway.
Yeah. And
this was an interesting time for Boulder because this was the first council that we ever had that was not basically white, presumably heterosexual. I know one gay guy, but white, heterosexual businessmen, almost exclusively. And the reason why it was a different council now with people like Penn Tate and Tim Fuller, Karen Padgett, who was the youngest council member to that time, she was still in her 20s, was the amendment giving 18-year-olds the right to vote had come into play. There had been a really big push to make sure students were registered to vote, and the complexion of council changed overnight. I mean, for one thing, they were women. Oh my God. That was also in quotes. So it, so
the oh my God,
that's,
not the women. They were actually women on city
they
council.
Were indeed. And so we were at a cusp anyway. This town was at a cusp, partly due to a federal amendment, an amendment to the federal constitution. And but it wasn't enough. We weren't far enough into that to, to be able to.
I'm sorry, what's the federal amendment to the Constitution that
the amendment to the Constitution that changed the age of people who the voting age.
Yeah.
The voting age. So that's one of the changes. We're going from, you asked a great question and I haven't answered it yet, but I've been going all around it.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that happened is we were no longer looking like we were in some kind of vanguard, even though we weren't really in some kind of vanguard. Another thing that changed was that people had, during that period of time, the opportunity to meet gay and lesbian people who were open. There was a little bit more coverage in the media. AIDS had happened. Yeah. And interestingly enough, AIDS in this country provided people who wanted to be homophobic with a lot of grounding for their homophobia, but it also humanized the especially gay male community for people, and then it humanized the whole queer community for people because non-LGBT people saw the whole LGBTQ community taking care of sick people, often when their communities weren't, the broader communities weren't. Yeah. It was like, oh my God, these are people. And they die.
It's interesting that you say that because I've always been kind of like amazed that queer rights seem to have improved through the AIDS pandemic, which to me seems like it made the uphill struggle much more difficult. But I guess in some ways it kind of cut the other direction, that it increased the amount of conversation that was going on. That's and right. People's awareness. And
well, then I think it really did give some people ammunition, and they used it.
Of course.
But it did that other thing. I mean, you had people like Rock Hudson coming out and dying very shortly after he came out. And you had these visible people in people's neighborhoods. And it happened in Boulder. Guys are coming back here and their neighbors are going, oh my God, this kid just came back and he's now in his 30s and he's dying. And I knew him when he was a kid. And, so there's this humanizing that went on. And again, part of it was also the humanizing of the community stepping up and saying, I know we're out because we're taking care of each other. That's just what's going to happen. And that happened here too with BCAP, which got started as a grassroots movement. BCAP, sorry, Boulder County AIDS Project.
Okay.
And these were like people who they weren't doctors. Some of them actually were, and some of them were nurses, but most of them weren't. They were, what do we do? I don't know. Well, he needs food. Okay, we'll figure out how to get him food. Okay, people just started working in the community to take care of folks who were sick. And other people saw that, often from a distance. And that, and then there were allies nationally who either had to voice more discrimination against people with AIDS or voice support. And there were enough who voiced support that there was a sense of another way of acting toward, in specifically sick gay men, but more generally, I think, people in the queer community. So that's one of the things that happened. I think the other thing that happened
I think of that. So was that going on prior to 1987? This community work that you're talking. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. The AIDS was in Colorado in the early 80s.
Okay.
And it was certainly here in Boulder in the early 80s. I mean, it's probably here earlier than that, in fact, but people started getting sick then. So people did have a chance to see that before 87. Absolutely.
Okay.
And they saw it locally, they saw it nationally. And again, we didn't win that vote by a whole heck of a lot, under 300 votes. Was not what you'd call a landslide. And I think I just want to give credit, if you will, to something else that I think is a part of the response to the question you asked, which is we were using, the queer community benefited from the strategies and from the visibility and from the changes that were made on behalf of the Black Civil Rights Movement and the women's movement, because people were seeing, we were wrong about that, and we were wrong about this, and maybe we're wrong about this other thing with gay people too, So I mean, there was this the 60s lasted a long time. The 60s lasted into the 70s. I think the 60s lasted until Richard Nixon got elected in 72, actually. But the results of the 60s and the early 70s were still sort of changing the landscape for people who had been in disapprobated groups. We're changing the landscape for people who had been marginalized. And and I think that's another, like it's easier to go later, and because people are a little bit primed to think these are people.
Yeah. One of our earliest guests on this show was Dave Ensign, who served on planning board, but also served in the gay community, helping with AIDS, kind of as you described. He told us a narrative about how he got involved, and that gave him hope in terms of political change and his ability to affect change in Boulder as on planning board.
Yes.
And I thought that was a really cool narrative that he shared. And I'm kind of curious if you feel hopeful, if as you've seen history unfold from 73 and prior to, it's 2023, it's 50 years. If we're on the right trajectory, and if you feel hope and excitement from what you've seen unfold, or if you got a mix of dread in there with what you see going on. I'm kind of just curious to hear you reflect on that.
That's a great question, Philip. If you had asked me this 3 years ago, 4 years ago, I would have had an unequivocal answer. And now it's a little mixed. And then it's not going to surprise you why it's mixed, but let me talk about that a bit. I feel like one of the most empowering and motivating things that ever happened to me was to be a lesbian at this time in history where so much could happen. Where when I came out, I was worried about losing custody of a child, where I was worried about would I have a career, where I was worried about what my life would be like in every possible way because I was a lesbian. And it has been an infusion of strength and hopefulness and agency. I would never have done half the things I've done if I had been one of my straight sisters.
Totally.
I had two, and as well as three brothers, all of whom were straight. It's powerful to be in a group that bands together, never perfectly, certainly, but bands together and says, we will make change, and then to do it. And it's imperfect change, but it's change. And it's hard to know change. There's some really interesting memory research about we don't know change when it's happening very well. I went to a doctor the other day. This is really a true story. I was at the doctor. She said, does this still hurt, this thing? Yeah, I'm not going to talk about my medical thing. And I said, oh, that's right. It did hurt before. But when it gets better, you don't notice it hurts anymore. And that's really nice because you don't have to live with that memory of that hurt. But it's also not nice because in the political realm, you forget how much change you have made. As a therapist, people used to say, is this working? I say, don't ask about, are you feeling better this week? Tell me how you were 6 months ago.
Yeah.
And then we can sort of think about, is change happening? But you have to make yourself think about it, because when it goes away, and you really don't think about it very much. But the historian part of me has made me think about it and think about it all the time. And it's made me hopeful individually, and it's made me hopeful socially and politically.
Yeah.
It also has taught me that change is not a straight line. It goes all over the place.
Positive change is not a given.
No, it is not a given. And if we walk into the sea and we feel a wave come in and almost knock us off our feet, we kind of gear up for that. And we know, like we could fall down and, it just happened to most of us if you've ever been in the ocean very much. Mm-hmm. But we forget that when that same wave goes back out, we have to steady ourselves too, because if we don't, that will also take us down. The backlash, if you will also take us under. And when we make progress, we're going to see backlash. It's natural. It is not even bad necessarily. I mean, it's not awful. I was once this was years ago when I was a graduate student. I was at a conference by a guy who was a family therapist, and he was showing this video, and it was a video, they always show like their wonderful videos that are success. And he shows us this video, and he's talking with this family. It's a single parent family, and there's a kid who's a fire starter in it. Not a kid you want to have in the house too much. And what he's trying to do in his model is to make it a family problem and not you're the bad kid who's an awful person. And that you could see they're making that progress. And then the mom says something that puts the kid back in the identified patient position, we would call it. He's like the bad kid. And the whole audience, this is a couple hundred therapists, they go, oh. And this therapist, I wish I could do an Argentinian accent because he was from Argentina, actually. This therapist turns off the video at that point. He says, why do you say, oh? He says, if you have a family and you want to change them, you don't want them to suddenly fall over dead in the face of your interventions. You want them to have enough strength to push back, because that means they can actually incorporate new things. If they can be pushed over by me, they can be pushed over by anything. Yeah. So don't go, oh, go, aha.
Interesting.
Which was one of the best lessons I've ever gotten. I don't remember a thing else out of that 2 days, but that was one of the most important lessons I ever got as a therapist, because that, in fact, is what happens. But it's also politically an incredible lesson. We don't want to be able to say, let's change it, and everything changes, because we're in danger of that right now.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah. You, there is a sense you want change to be slowish and in the right direction. Because you don't want quick change in the wrong direction.
Yes.
I guess is one way of thinking about it.
Well, and if things get you don't want to destabilize the system too much, because then you get a very high probability of going in the wrong direction. That's where we are right now in this country. I'm generally very optimistic about most things, and I'm sort of an optimistic character. But right now, there's been a lot of destabilization for a lot of reasons, not the least of which was having a president for 4 years who talked about it's okay to call people bad names, and it's okay to, and in fact, it's a good idea to polarize the heck out of people. Yeah. And, that's dangerous stuff.
For sure.
That's dangerous.
Very.
So right now, one thing I know is when you have the change and you have the backlash, you have to anticipate the backlash and you have to work with the backlash. So my politics is always a working underneath. I'm doing some work now of doing interpersonal and institutional attitude change around trans folks, because trans folks are under siege. Yeah. They're under siege. There's no mistaking it.
Explicitly.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so, but you do that. I'm not working on a campaign. There is no campaign here at this point. There may be next year, but I am. But my job, I've been writing blogs about it. I've been, and I'm gathering a group of volunteers who will do some work, and just having conversations. Here's what we know. What do you need to hear about it? What's your concern? And there's a nice model that's been well researched that we'll be using for that. And that's the dig in, because the backlash is here, and you don't want it to throw us all under the water. We need to be standing and doing things to make good things happen.
That's actually a perfect segue into my last question.
Okay.
Which is, what can Boulder do to be more inclusive and welcoming to queer folks?
Well, oh gosh.
Maybe that's not a closer.
Yeah, it's not a straightforward, easy answer. I think a part of it is to stop thinking we're so done with this. In the same way that we have to stop thinking we're so done with racism, we have to stop thinking we're so done with xenophobia, we have to stop thinking we're so done with sexism. Give me a break.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a good town in so many ways. It has so many wonderful parts to it. It's why it's been really hard for me to leave, even when I wanted to. And one of the things that would help us to move ahead more is to do the work underneath of just saying, what did I really learn? And what do I really feel in my heart of hearts? And what do I need to do about that? And can I find, for me as a white person, can I find some other white people with whom I can talk about what we learned and help each other unlearn it, so that we're not expecting people of color to help us unlearn it, but we can do it ourselves? I think that's a piece of it. We're so afraid of history right now because it shows us up as bad. What do we think about? What do we do? For those of us who have kids, we don't want to deny what they did that was a problem. We want to help them to correct what was a problem. And you don't have to do that by being mean to people. In fact, that's not the best way to do that. The way to do that is to say, what the heck were we thinking? And how do we get out of that? And will you help me do that? And here's the support I need. And not expecting somebody else in the group that we've done it to, but to expect our friends who are in our own group to do that with us. I think that's a piece of it. I think a piece of it is to think about housing and issues like that. That's been an issue for I knew people in the early days, like in the 70s, who would lie about, we're really sisters. They weren't sisters. And some of them weren't lovers either. They just needed more people in a house than could afford to, rent that house.
Yeah.
I think those kinds of issues are there. And I think, in general, what we can do for everybody in this town is to do everything to reduce polarization. I'm actually thinking, this is a little silly, I'm actually thinking of a little campaign through a letter to the editor that's something like, can we get back to thanking people in traffic for letting us in? Not just letting us in, but thank them. And because thanking helps the person who's doing the gratitude, and it helps the person receiving the gratitude. And it's a day-to-day thing. And anybody who drives, it happens all the time. Somebody who doesn't cut you off, or,
This actually hits a nerve with me, because as someone who doesn't own a car,
thank you.
I can feel that I have some anger issues around the way drivers behave towards me, and I'm not super inclined to thank drivers for their courteous behavior right now.
It's an antidote to what is going on.
That's right.
I understand why it would be and
I love it.
I am a driver, and I try to be incredibly visible in my thanking people. It changes people's day to be thanked.
Yeah.
People actually remember that all day.
Yep. Glenda, thank you so much for spending time talking with me this morning. I know the subject of LGBTQ history is just such a huge subject, and it's unrealistic to cram it all into an hour interview. But I really appreciate the anecdotes about the history of what happened in city council and your service to the community. I really admire you.
Well, it's been a true pleasure to talk with you, and partly because you're right there. I mean, you were right there, and I felt so understood in what I was saying. That's a nice feeling.
Oh, good. Well, thank you for participating. It was really lovely.
Gonna find me a residential pedestrian district where I can gracefully grow older. Gonna spend my remaining years sharing Boulder.
Thank you for listening to Sharing Boulder. Please support the podcast by sharing it with your friends and neighbors. You can contact me at linktree/Philip Ogren, which you can find by visiting sharingboulder.us, where you can also find show notes and previous episodes. This episode of Sharing Boulder was produced by Philip Ogren and edited by Katie Avery. The music was created by Nathaniel Ogren and Sack Lunch. Keep sharing, Boulder.